Good morning, friends. As we examine the kingdom parables of Matthew chapter 13, we see more and more how the Lord, who is the king of the kingdom, how he is the one who builds that kingdom himself. Yes, he uses his people, and we'll explore that more tomorrow if he allows. And so, in being used by God, by the king, we can legitimately say that we are also about the business of kingdom building, but ultimately, God is the one who builds that kingdom through us. And this is actually true of all kingdoms, as we mentioned in yesterday's message. In Romans 13, we read that there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So, of course, God builds the heavenly kingdom, the kingdom of God, but he is also in charge of and institutes all the other kingdoms of the earth. We saw this back in Daniel chapter 4 when Daniel interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the tree that reaches into the heavens. Because Daniel explains that that kingdom will in fact be taken away from Nebuchadnezzar for a certain length of time until, as Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And so, even when it comes to these earthly kingdoms, even heathen kingdoms, and the other empires of the earth, they have their times ruling over the earth, over vast quantities of people. But even they would not be able to do that if God Himself did not bring it about according to His providential purpose. Because He does. He uses all things for His perfect purpose. Everything from what happens in our personal lives on an individual day-to-day basis to those world-altering events that transpire in governments and in between nations. Which just, of course, reinforces all the more that God is the one who builds any kingdom, certainly his own kingdom, and he will bring his kingdom to completion in his timing exactly according to his purpose. And we, of course, can take joy in that. For all who trust in the Lord for salvation will enjoy that kingdom forevermore. Now, I do, of course, want you to hold on to that idea. I want you to hold that close, latch hold of this truth, and never let it go. Because in knowing what our final destination is, there is joy and there is confidence and there is peace there. But there's actually an application that deals with joy and peace and confidence that comes to us every day. And so I want to bring this to you in a more of an immediate fashion here right now, because the principle that is involved in the fact that Jesus, the King, is bringing his kingdom to fullness and completion in his timing is also stated for us in Psalm 127 verses 1 and 2 when it comes even to day matters. We read, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep." Now, as we think about this principle that God is in charge, that he has a will, that he has a purpose, and that purpose applies to his kingdom and to the whole span of the ages of what he's going to bring to be in eternity, but it also has application to day-to-day things. And so there's two main things that we need to consider here from this passage. The first one being that if the Lord isn't the one to build a house, then the builders do all their work in vain. The idea being, of course, that if you have something as simple and as mundane as a building project, well, if that building, the house, or whatever it might be, if it's not God's will for that to be built, then it doesn't matter how hard the workers work. It doesn't matter how ingenious the design or how talented the architect or how much funding is available. If for whatever reason, according to God's purpose, it's actually against his will for that building to be built, it's not going to be built. It's not going to come to completion. It's going to be a project that is done in vain. Okay, it's going to result in nothing because God's purposes cannot be thwarted. His will cannot be overcome. In a similar way, the other illustration that's given is that if soldiers stand watch over a city to make sure that it's, not surprised by attack and captured, easily by an enemy. Well, again, if for whatever reason the Lord ordains that the city is going to be attacked and it is going to be overwhelmed, in a single night, then it doesn't matter how vigilant the watchers may be, because again, no matter how hard you might fight, no matter how hard you might work, if you're doing it against the will of God, well, you're not going to win, because God's will cannot be defeated. And so we see here actually kind of the logical opposite side of the coin that we looked at in yesterday's message concerning the kingdom, because the Lord's will is that his kingdom will be built and his will shall be accomplished. And now we see, of course, the other side of that, which is that when a person has their own will and it's contrary to God's will, well, then that person's will shall not be accomplished, because again, God's plans can't be thwarted. He will always bring to fruition whatever he intends, And the point then is that we must recognize that he is God, that we are not, that his ways are perfect, and so we best get on the same page with God. The point of the Christian life, the point of our relationship with God, the point of prayer is not to find a way to bend God to our will, but that we would be conformed to his will. Because not only is that where the success is, that's where the peace is. Because we consider that next line in Psalm 127 where we read, again, "It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he, God, gives to his beloved, his people, he gives them sleep." Now, please listen carefully to this, because maybe this is not as pertinent of an application to everyone, but I dare say it is probably to most people, because many of us spend way too much time. Not that working hard is bad, but we rise up early, we go to bed late, and perhaps we lay awake in bed worrying about things because we're trying to do those things in our own power. We have our desires, we have our dreams, we have our demands, and so we strive for them. But again, we tend to strive and try to achieve them in our own power, and we don't pay heed to the will of God concerning these things. Because this is not about, saying always that God, doesn't want to do these things, that, we have our desires. And so, of course, simply because they're our desires, then, of course, God doesn't want to do them, as if God is just one giant wet blanket. No, that may not be the case. It may be that God is more than willing to grant those dreams and those desires to us. And yet, if we're still trying to achieve them on our own, in our own power, then we're not submitting to God's full will, because his will is that he do those things by his power in and through us. And so even if God is willing to do those things, and so our desires, our dreams are quote unquote good in this way, if we try to do them in our own power, it results in nothing but anxiety, worry, fear, and just incredible amounts of stress. And yet, what does the Psalm say is the remedy if we just submit ourselves to the Lord and what he wants, and doing things the way he wants? Because we're essentially told that the Lord gives sleep to his beloved. If we are willing to trust the Lord, if we're willing to submit to the Lord, if we're willing to be used of the Lord, and acknowledge that he is the one who's actually making things happen, we'll be able to sleep at night. We'll be able to lay in bed with confidence concerning the next day, because we're not trying to do things in our own power at that point. We're not attempting to work at cross purposes to God, to yank the wheel or the tiller out of his hand. Rather, we're humbling ourselves before the Lord, saying, "Nevertheless, not my will be done, but your will be done." And yes, I want to be honest. That means that sometimes we do have to let go of some things. Sometimes we do have to let go of dreams and desires and demands if they're not in line with the will of God. But that should not come as a surprise to us, because if they're not in God's will, they're not actually good for us. And the Lord said very, very upfront that being his disciple means denying ourselves, giving up our own lives. But he also tells us that in giving up our own lives in this way, we actually find real, true life, the kind of life he can give to us. Because in submitting to the will of God, we find those things that are otherwise so very rare in this life. We find actual confidence, contentment, happiness, and peace. And I say these things are rare rather than non-existent in this life apart from God, because there is some semblance of these things out there. The enemy grants and helps people to have just enough confidence, contentment, happiness, and peace at times to keep them satisfied and longing for more, because that is what happens. They experience a little bit of joy or maybe a momentary peace, but it is fleeting, and it leaves the person just with that greater hole to be filled. But in the Lord, we experience these things for real. They are not mirages like they are in the world. For the Lord gives those who trust in him, he gives them things like sleep. As the proverb says, when we trust in the Lord, when we seek his wisdom and direction rather than our own, then you will walk on your way, the proverb says. You will walk on your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. So think on these things, that when it comes to any aspect of life, whether it's the things you have going on in your family, the things that you're so tempted to be worried about that you take into your own plans and your own machinations of how things ought to work out, whether you're talking about that or the cosmic eternal things like God's kingdom, in both cases, submit to the Lord and I'm not going to say allow, because it's not like we could stop him anyway, but conform yourself to his purposes and just be part of what he is doing. Don't resist what he is willing to do in your life, that it might be done by his power through you rather than yourself. And that's when you will know what peace really is. That is when you'll know what happiness and contentment really is. So think on these things, friends. Submit to the Lord, and I pray this helps you to have a good and godly day today. And Lord willing, I will see you soon.